Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. It is Tori, and today I am here to give you my February 2024 wrap-up. Now, to be honest, it still doesn't feel like we're actually in 2024 already. It's kind of wild that we're already 2 months through. Maybe it's just me and I'm getting old and things are moving at a faster pace than they used to, but I'm just kind of flabbergasted that we're already 2 months into 2024. But I had a really interesting and mixed bag month of reads this February, and I'm excited to talk about them. I've been kind of going through my journey of reading all 10 of the SPIFBO or Self-Published Fantasy Blog Off finalists. I have 2.5 left. I did a little bit of rereading this month. I had an awesome experience with the February Cosmic Footsteps book club pick, and I'm excited to talk about all of those. So the first book that I finished in February is actually a book that I had a short story in. For those of you that were around the indie community back in December of 2023, there was an anthology that was produced and coordinated by Dom from Dominish Books here on BookTube, and he brought together 24 indie authors to write an essentially an advent calendar anthology from December 1st through the 24th, and people who joined the Kickstarter would get a story every day through the month of December. And I was one of those indie authors, and I wrote a short story in this anthology called Cold Silver for Souls, which I am now working on expanding into a larger series, and that's been a blast. But this anthology I've been kind of slowly working my way through since December and just taking it a little bit at a time. And man, you guys, like, what was so cool about being a part of this anthology is that it's really a small exploration of just how vast of a variety we have in the indie genre, and just there's something for everybody. There are so many different takes on epic fantasy tropes and settings and characters in this anthology. It's like a little taste test extravaganza. And just a huge shout out to all of my fellow authors on this anthology, and for Dom putting in an incredible amount of work to pull this off and to get us all together and to write his own story in the anthology and do a bunch of the behind the scenes work to get it finished and finalized for the hardcover special edition that's coming out soon. So yeah, it was just a very cool project to be a part of, and I highly recommend you guys check it out if you haven't already. The next book that I read was A Rival Most Vile by R.K. Ashwick, and this is one of the SPIFBO 9 finalists this year. So this book, for me personally, was not a good fit, and I kind of knew that going into it. I'm not typically a very avid cozy fantasy reader, and I typically also am not a romance reader, and so those two things together, it's not my cup of tea. I tend to like a little bit more meat and potatoes, if you will, with my stories, and this one I felt like, you know, it was written very well, and actually one of the things that I found the most interesting about it that I really liked was the way that R.K. Ashwick explored the potions making aspect of this story. I thought that was really intriguing and fun, and something that I hadn't read in fantasy before. But when it came to the characters and the plot line of the story, I just wasn't finding that investment that I like in my reads. So it kind of just came down to, this is just not a book that is for me personally. After I finished Rival Most Vile, I decided to do a reread of one of my favorite, or continue a reread of one of my favorite series of all time, and that is Golden Sun by Pierce Brown, which is book 2 in the first Red Rising trilogy. I love this book. I love this series so much. This trilogy means the absolute world to me. The characters, every time it feels like going home when I read it, and I love it so much. So I needed this as a comfort read, and also because I am working my way through the series so that I can continue on to Iron Gold and Dark Age and Lightbringer, the second half of this Red Rising saga. And so Morning Star is up on the docket next, which I cannot wait for. It's one of my favorite books of all time. But yeah, just reading through this again, it was super inspiring. I needed that kind of creative boost to go back to stories that really mean a lot to me as I'm trying to get myself back into the writing groove. And this was exactly what I needed. I needed that connection with a story that really has meant a lot to me, and I am just having a blast rereading this series. So I'm really looking forward to getting forward into Morning Star and just experiencing that all over again. And then moving on in the series. It's going to be a good time. Next up is a book that I actually buddy read with my father, and I know I've mentioned some of my buddy reads with him on the channel in the past, where he and I sometimes struggle to find an overlap of stories that we like to read. He definitely is not much of a fantasy reader, and he likes a lot of more real-world kind of historical fiction, and that's kind of where our tastes overlap the most, is historical fiction or historical accounts. Sometimes classics every once in a while, but in general, more of the historical fiction side of things. And so we picked up The Wager by David Grann. The Wager is the story of a shipwreck that happened back in the mid 1700s, and it's a mystery still to this day, because the ship, the Wager, was shipwrecked on this island, which is now called Wager Island. There's literally still pieces of the shipwreck there, and what happened was there were kind of two different groups of survivors that made it off of the island and back to England, and told two very different versions of what had happened on the island. And David Grann kind of goes through all of the evidence, all of the accounts, and all of the different journals that these survivors had written during that process and afterwards, and kind of just puts together all of the information that we have about this very harrowing survival experience, and the mutinies that occurred, and what led to the shipwreck in the first place, and how the survivors managed to get back to England, and then the trials that ensued when those two different stories did not match up. I loved taking this little swerve away from fantasy as a break, and this is a very, very well written book. I look forward to reading more of David Grann's work, because he definitely does a good job putting all of the information in front of you and just telling a compelling story with the information that is out there, without, I felt like, really inserting too strong of an authorial bias, which is always difficult. So really, really loved this book. I had a great time with it, and it reads very quickly for historical fiction. So highly recommend this one for anybody that is interested in that kind of story. Okay, guys, this one's going to be a little tough to talk about, and I'm sure I'm going to make some people a little upset with this read. So I had been talking about doing this buddy read with my friend Matt from Matt on Books for probably over a year now, and we finally got to it in February. We read the first Lankmar books the first Lankmar book by Fritz Leiber, and that was Swords and Deviltry, which is the kind of origin stories of two very well-beloved classic fantasy characters, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and they're touted very heavily by a lot of readers as kind of the archetypal fantasy bromance, right? That we get all of our modern fantasy bromances are kind of an offshoot of that. I read enough classic fantasy that I know my way around it pretty well, and I am, comfortable in it, comfortable reading it, really enjoy a lot of it. This one was everything I don't like about fantasy stories all wrapped up into a single book. I struggled so much with this one, you guys, I'm not gonna lie. And, as somebody who really, really loves deep connections between characters and the fantasy bromances of, Locke and Jean and Royce and Hadrian and a lot of these more modern bromances, this one fell really, really flat for me. There was a lot of authorial male gaze, which really bothered me, especially in the first story. The female characters in this book I found to be incredibly trite and just very one note. The bromance between Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, I didn't really connect with them as characters prior to them meeting at all, and when they did meet, it was just kind of an instant, oh, we're best friends now. I didn't love this, you guys. I really, really disliked it a lot. I really struggled to finish it, and it's not that long of a book. It looks thick, but honestly, this is 4 different books in a single omnibus, so it was only this much was the first book. I really, really did not like this at all. I will not be continuing the series, and the one thing about it, though, is that Matt and I had a lot of really good conversations about it, and it was interesting because in the Discord chat that we were talking about it, there were some people that do really love this series and kind of grew up reading it, or it was a gateway for them. And it was really interesting to hear the perspective that they had on the story. Honestly, for me, this one fell really flat. I do not like this book at all. I have no interest in continuing, and I will take my modern fantasy bromances over this 1,000 times because I didn't get any depth out of this, and this one was a really tough sell for me. But I've read it, and I'm continuing my quest to experience a lot of the older fantasy books that have informed a lot of the modern fantasy that we have today. So in that, I think it was a good experience. I just personally will not be continuing this series. After that, I dipped over to another older fantasy book, and this one was for my Cosmic Footsteps book club, which essentially, if you're new here, is a book club that I started for 2024, wherein I will be reading a classic or older science fiction or fantasy written by a female author every month, one a month until the end of 2024. In January, I read Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier, which was so good. And that was going to be a tough one to follow, and I was a little worried about that. But for February, my patrons voted on The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia A. McKillop, which is a tiny little book, and this has gotten a lot of attention and praise as being a kind of really beautiful pillar of the fantasy genre around the time it was written. And Patricia McKillop has won a ton of awards for her writing. And man, like, I can tell. And it was such a beautiful story, and still had that kind of, like, there was still a little bit of a surface level feel to it through a lot of the story, but you never lost sight of the deeper themes that were running through the story. There's a lot of growing. This is honestly a coming of age story in a lot of ways for multiple characters. It's the story of a young woman who had to raise a child that was not her own, and so there's a lot of themes of motherhood and watching your child grow up as you're trying to grow up alongside them. There's a vengeance arc in here, and also we have, you know, our main character Sybil. She's a magic user who lives kind of on the fringes of society, and she has all of these mythical creatures that she has called to her through her magic who protect her. And basically the gist of the story is that the outside world starts to try to pull her into the politics and the conflicts that arise, because obviously as someone who can utilize magic and affect people's minds, she's a hot commodity, right? And so it's a really, really interesting exploration of the character of Sybil, our protagonist, and her relationship to the characters around her and the world around her, and magic versus the natural human world. It's a really beautiful story. It reads very quickly, but it is very poetic. She has a really beautiful writing style. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book, and I would highly recommend it for anybody who is looking to delve into some classic fantasy for sure, because it's a quick read, really beautifully written, and has some great character themes in it. Next, I continued my journey through Spy X Family by Tatsuya Endo, and that is a manga series that I've been reading since I think December is when I started it. And this series still continues to delight me, and I actually liked, these were volumes 7 and 8 that I read in February, and I think these two volumes I like even better than some of the kind of middle ones that I'd read before that, because we're continuing to get into our dysfunctional family. And again, if you've missed the premise of this series, it is a elite spy who enters a marriage of convenience with a woman that he does not know is a master assassin, and they together have an adopted daughter who is a telepath. And it is a little bit spy thriller, a lot dysfunctional family, and just beautiful, honest themes of being a parent and trying to be in a family and what that looks like, and the struggle of trying to raise a child. On top of all of the, you know, assassin and spy things going on in the background. So the fact that the 6-year-old daughter is the only one in the family who knows everything that's going on because she's a telepath, it's a delightful series, and I would highly recommend it for anybody interested in reading manga, especially if you're new to manga. I think that this is a series that would be a really easy gateway for people that maybe aren't as familiar with the storytelling style of manga. But yeah, I'm absolutely loving it. I'm excited to get into the next couple of volumes here in March. And yeah, highly recommend. I've been having an absolute blast with this series. The final book that I read here in February was Priest of Crowns by Peter McLean. And this is book 4 of the quartet War for the Rose Throne. And this one is, starts off in Priest of Bones with Thomas Piety, who is a war veteran who comes back to his city to reestablish himself as a kind of mob or gang leader. And it starts very intimate in this one city where he's reestablishing his position here. And then it very quickly expands and he gets pulled into the larger theater of politics in the nation itself through the rest of the quartet. And this is a series that I still feel very conflicted on, now even having read 4 books. They are very bingeable reads. They're incredibly well characterized. Thomas Piety is one of the strongest first-person narratives I have ever read. It is incredibly consistent, incredibly just poignant and vibrant, brilliantly written that way, and the world has a very consistently gritty atmosphere that's just palpable. You feel it as you're reading the story. And I think for me, essentially, just some of the decisions that were made during the course of the story weren't where I was hoping the story was going to go, and I struggled with it a little bit and just had a hard time really fully immersing in the story, because I was kind of, I liked what was going on in the first book more than I liked the subsequent books. And then the ending of this 4th book, and again, I will not spoil for anybody who hasn't read it, but the ending of this 4th book really wasn't my favorite. I felt very let down at the end of the 4th book, which honestly, I know why, and I don't want to talk about it for spoiler's sake, but I would say that for people who really enjoy Joe Abercrombie's work, Peter McLean is an absolute must-read. If you are a big First Law fan, please pick up War for the Rose Throne, because I think there's a lot of similarities in the style and tone of the story and the kind of things that Peter McLean is concerned with in terms of themes and how he wants the story to be structured. So highly would recommend it for fans of First Law, and I think some of the reasons that First Law didn't work for me are maybe some of the same reasons that I had a hard time with this one. But overall, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that this is an incredibly well-written first-person narrative, and a lot of the character work and relationships between the characters I found really compelling. This is also one of the better portrayals I have seen of somebody struggling with PTSD. There's a lot of, I think, really strong mental health rep in this series, which I was really impressed by. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to love in this series, and I would highly recommend it for people that are grimdark fans, again, who are fans of Joe Abercrombie. But yeah, for me, the ending was a struggle. But yeah, I still took a lot of things away from the series, and despite my reservations with where the story was going, I still got through all 4 books and found things to enjoy. So I definitely will admit that. So I am continuing to learn a lot about myself as a reader, which is always a good thing. And I had a really mixed bag this month, but it was all, I learned from all of the books that I read, which is always a goal of mine. So I hope you guys also had a fantastic month of reading. I hope you are reading 5-star reads. And I will see you guys in the next video.